Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here are your hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back. This is our 33rd episode of Press the Button. I'm Joe Cirincione, president of Plowshares Fund.
And I'm Michelle Dover, director of programs.
And we are delighted to give you another exciting episode. It's jam-packed, so let's go through very briefly what we have on tap. Michelle, you lead off with the news?
No, actually, this week it is Tom Collina who will be hosting Early Warning. I know. Well, since we're both out of the office, we have to entrust Tom.
Don't tell them we're out of the office.
Important endeavor.
They don't want to, shouldn't know we taped this in advance. Okay.
And after that, we have a question for you from a member of our vast, far-reaching, and yes, international fan base. This question comes from Sweden. And it is on the
Beatrice
treaty
Finn. She's
on
asking me a question.
non-proliferation.
It's on non-proliferation. Oh, the treaty.
Yes.
Treaty. Okay, good. I'm looking forward to this. This will be great.
Then you, Joe, cover the interview.
Right. We have a great interview with two authors from the Cato Institute, John Glaser and Chris Preble. They wrote with A. Trevor Thrall a new book, Fuel to the Fire. It's all about how America is overextended militarily. We have too many bases. We're spending too much money. We're involved in too many wars, and we don't have to be. We can keep America safe and strong and save our resources for more urgent domestic needs. You want to listen to Chris and John tell us how and why. And since this is Thanksgiving week, later on in the show, we're going to have a special announcement about Giving Tuesday. That's that time of year, the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, where you can give back to the organizations working on the causes you care about. And this Thanksgiving, we hope that those causes include Plowshares Fund, and we'll show you how your gift can earn you, yes, this is it, a special Press the Button mug.
But as always, if you like what you hear, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share. We really appreciate your feedback and definitely incorporate it into the show.
The clock is ticking. Let's go.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Welcome to Early Warning. I'm going to call this the Hale Fellowship edition of Early Warning. That's because we have the former and current Hale Fellow here at Plowshares. Our former fellow, Catherine Killough, is here. She's gone on to greener pastures as the Advocacy and Leadership Coordinator for Women Cross DMZ. And we have the current Hale Fellow, Akshai Vikram, who is here focusing on the 2020 elections and nuclear policy issues. For those of you that don't know, the Hale Fellowship was named after Plowshares' former board chair and longtime supporter, Roger Hale. And this is a paid fellowship here at Plowshares Fund to work on nuclear policy. So if you want to be the next Hale Fellow and you want to find out more about the fellowship, please come to our website. And now, Catherine and Akshay, welcome. Great to have you both here. Let's get down to the issues. There are a lot of things going on. We're going to do 2 quick takes and 2 deep dives to cover the issues of the last week. First, because this is Washington, we have to talk about impeachment. We've had 2 weeks of in-depth, incredibly impressive and eye-opening hearings, and yet, in the big picture, it seems like nothing has changed. The House is expected to impeach. The Senate is not, and it's going to be up to the American people to decide next November. So stay tuned. Number 2, the Pope was in Hiroshima and Nagasaki this weekend, calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons. This was Pope Francis's first trip to Japan, but not the first time he talked for the elimination of nuclear weapons. And this is part of the Pope's effort to move the Catholic Church away from its Cold War stance when it supported nuclear deterrence. So go Francis, keep it up. Now to our deep dives. Catherine, we'll start with you on North Korea and what's going on with the possibility of talks. The United States has suspended the military exercises. President Trump is tweeting to Kim Jong-un that he wants to see him soon. What do you expect to happen? Are we going to have a summit or no?
I don't know if we'll see a summit, but the year-end deadline is looming. North Korea set this deadline back in April in an effort to accelerate the negotiations, particularly as the U.S. has been dragging its feet on North Korea's demands for sanctions relief and other security guarantees. The question, though, that's on everyone's mind is, what is North Korea actually going to do come January? Are we going to see an ICBM launch? Are they going to do another nuclear test and break their self-imposed moratorium? The North Korea Special Envoy, Stephen Biegun, who just last week was giving a testimony at a hearing for his nomination to become the Deputy Secretary of State, he seems to think that this is the case. He has called the deadline an artificial one and has warned that we may see North Korea revert to its provocative cycle. But even as the deadline is artificial and arbitrarily set by North Korea, I think we need to ask ourselves, the consequences of North Korea determining that it's not worthwhile to talk to the U.S. anymore. Those are real. And that's a reality we haven't fully confronted.
So isn't this kind of a train wreck in the making, whereas one side sees a deadline, the other does not?
Right.
Right. And so the United States isn't taking it seriously. So the North might actually resume dangerous activities in the new year. What's the president going to do?
Right. Well, hopefully something. We need some movement on this. We know that North Korea has not actually stopped its nuclear development. They haven't handed over nuclear weapons. But if we look back over the past year, 2 years, our engagement has actually tangibly reduced military tensions. It has slowed their nuclear development. So this is a question that we need to honestly answer. And it's something that I found very frustrating at the Democratic debates last week. The one question posed on North Korea framed the entire undertaking of diplomacy as one of making concessions. And if we continue to hold out on this all or nothing approach, then that leaves us with really no viable options for peacefully managing this relationship. And in particular, the way that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden responded to the question really exposed the way that our leaders see the relationship between the U.S. and South Korea, this alliance that we have. They not once mentioned how South Korea has been leading and pushing for this diplomatic effort. And I think in their disregard of South Korea's policy goals, they failed to treat South Korea as an equal partner. So that was really disappointing.
Got it. No, thank you. And I believe Senator Harris's exact words about the president's behavior with North Korea is, "You got punked."
Yep.
Or something along those lines. Akshay, you've been watching the campaign and you watched the debate last week. We had more activity going on foreign policy issues than we've seen before. Give us the highlights and the lowlights as you see them.
Sure. So I think it was a good night for diplomacy with Iran. You saw Senator Harris and reiterate her support for the Iran nuclear deal that Obama negotiated. You saw Bernie Sanders talk about diplomacy between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I think it was also a good night for arms control in general. Senator Klobuchar once again mentioned the need to negotiate with the Russians on arms control, specifically mentioning both the New START Treaty and the INF Treaty, which he has done in several other media appearances recently. I think it was a little bit of a mixed record on defense spending. Mayor Pete decided that he was going to artfully dodge the question about whether he was going to cut the defense budget if elected, and instead said he would reprioritize without committing to actually decreasing the defense budget. On the other side of the ledger, Senator Warren, in her closing statement, made a forceful case for eliminating corruption in defense budgeting and in policy making. I think that goes with the theme that we heard from the Pope this weekend, which goes back to Eisenhower, that any dollar spent on nuclear weapons is a dollar not spent on something more uplifting.
Wow.
Thank you very much. And as usual, it's a pleasure working with both of you, both the previous and current Hale Fellow. And our time is up.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
And now, joining us for a special announcement about Giving Tuesday is our Deputy Director of Development, Bonnie Fisk.
Thanks, Joe. I'm here to tell everyone about Giving Tuesday coming up next Tuesday, December 3rd. Every year, the Tuesday after Thanksgiving is set aside for this global movement where people can give back to their communities.
And we know that everyone has lots of causes that they give to, but we'd like you to consider giving to Plowshares Fund this Giving Tuesday. We are the only foundation focused exclusively on eliminating the threat from nuclear weapons.
Exactly. We're asking that you consider a one-time gift on Giving Tuesday or potentially supporting Plowshares Fund and our work year-round through our monthly recurring giving program. For as little as $5 a month, you can set this up and it gets deducted from your account automatically.
Is this where I tell them about the swag?
Yes.
If you give us a gift of $10, we'll send you an exclusive Press the Button sticker. It'll look great on your laptop. But if you give us a recurring gift, which is more valuable to us, or a one-time gift of $50, then you get the coveted Press the Button mug. We usually give these only to in-studio guests, but as a donor, we're happy to send one to you. So Bonnie, if we've convinced people to give, how do they get involved?
They can visit plowshares.org/Giving Tuesday on December 3rd, because the swag is only available for gifts made that day on Giving Tuesday.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you, Joe.
Letters, we get letters, we get stacks and stacks of letters.
Welcome back to the Q&A session. Joe, are you ready for this?
I am. Let's go.
Today's question comes from Moss in Sweden, who thinks that we have a very interesting podcast. So thank you very much, Moss.
Thank you, Moss.
And the question is about how there was a debate in Sweden concerning whether or not the Swedish parliament should sign the ban treaty or not.
Yes.
And there were numerous arguments, but one of the biggest ones against signing the treaty was that there was no real way of controlling the countries who have signed the treaty on, whether they are actually following the treaty. So no verification mechanisms, unlike the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In the end, the Swedish parliament chose not to sign the treaty out for other reasons. But Moss's question is the ban treaty an effective treaty to ban nuclear weapons, or is it just a, quote, paper treaty with no real effect?
Oh, a paper treaty, being like the Constitution or the Magna Carta, or the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, does not have a verification mechanism in there. Over 190 countries have sworn never to develop nuclear weapons. There's no verification mechanism in the NPT. So in that sense, the International Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is what we're talking about, popularly called the Ban Treaty, is very similar to that. But I get your point. I mean, this is the, sort of the bomb in the basement problem. If everybody gives up their nuclear weapons and we, the United States, or we, France, give up our nuclear weapons, how do we know that Canada's not going to come out the next day and say, oh, we have a bomb and we want to renegotiate the St. Lawrence Seaway Treaty? Right.
Are you saying we blame Canada?
But Moss raises a good point. And there are three basic answers to this problem of verification. One is you can develop a verification mechanism. The IAEA, for example, monitors all known nuclear reactors and nuclear facilities to make sure nobody's using technology for civilian purposes to produce military usable materials. You could extend that kind of system if you want. Unfortunately, you're never going to be 100% sure, right? So the other thing you have to realize is, one, even if you have a small nuclear weapon, countries of the world still have massive conventional military capability that could deter even a small nuclear arsenal from being used. And for example, the United States for 4 years had a monopoly on nuclear weapons. We didn't use them in part because of concern about the larger conventional war that would initiate. Number three is actually the most serious and depressing answer to this, is when you eliminate nuclear weapons, you don't eliminate the nuclear knowledge. So people could build nuclear weapons again. So if one country were to break out, the other countries could decide, okay, that experiment failed. We couldn't get rid of nuclear weapons. Let's go build them again. And that is really a very strong argument for the treaty banning nuclear weapons. That is, you can safely do this. You can move down this road, and every step you take reducing the arsenals makes you safer, and if you get rid of them, you're safer still. You prevented madness or accident or miscalculation from causing a nuclear catastrophe. And if in the end it doesn't work, it's okay. You can go back and recreate the nuclear arsenals. And that is why we at Plowshares Fund are strong supporters of the treaty to ban nuclear weapons. And countries like Sweden, who once considered having a nuclear weapons program, they were on track to build 100 nuclear weapons before they thought better of it in the 60s and 70s. That's why countries like Sweden should, in fact, follow the lead of so many countries that already have and signed this treaty, and those that have signed it should bring it into force as soon as possible. We need this treaty to make the world a safer place.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm delighted to be at the Plowshares offices today with John Glaser, the Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, and with Christopher Preble, who's Vice President for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. And we're going to talk about your new book. First of all, thank you for joining us, and congratulations on this book.
Thanks, Joe. It's really great to be here.
Yeah, it's our pleasure.
Well, I love this book. It's written just the way I would like. It's tight, it's filled with details, but it's extremely readable. So right off the bat, I want to recommend our listeners get this book. I think of this as a book that's essential reading for understanding the mess that we're in right now, how we got in this mess, and this is the helpful part, how we can get out. So the book is called Fuel to the Fire: How Trump Made America's Broken Foreign Policy Even Worse. And here's the key part, and how we can recover. So let's get going. On the very first page of the book, you write that Donald Trump's rise in the Republican primaries and eventually to the presidency, quote, represented an astonishing break with the Washington, D.C. foreign policy consensus that had prevailed from Harry Truman to Barack Obama. What do you mean? What is or was that consensus?
Well, I think the consensus revolves around American leadership. This is a term that's thrown around here in this town a lot. It revolves around American military dominance. It revolves around a presence around the world, an active, forward U.S. military presence. It includes the alliance structure that was created during the Cold War and then substantially extended after the Cold War. The protections and security guarantees that we afford. And importantly, it involves the wars that the United States has fought, not just the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the other wars related to the war on terror, but of course, even in the 1990s, the U.S. military was extremely active. And the reason why is we were no longer afraid of bumping up against the big old bad Soviet Union. And so we were fairly active even in the 1990s, even before the war on terror began.
So I think, you can say a lot of things about President Trump, but one thing that's for sure is he has a sharp tongue. And so during the campaign, he had a lot of harsh, blunt criticisms of American foreign policy that occasionally landed on some of the same rhetoric that, for example, we at the Cato Institute have used. So we talk about allied burden sharing as a problem in NATO, for example. We talk about the problem of being overcommitted militarily around the world. We talk about what a bad strategic decision nation building and regime change wars are. And these are all things that Donald Trump mentioned. That said, it's a sort of even a broken clock is right twice a day sort of thing. He stumbled upon some of that same rhetoric, but I never viewed him as in the restraint camp or having a distinct foreign policy preference for sort of American retrenchment.
Yeah, right. The first speaker for those listening was Chris, and the second was John. So let's just keep track of it. Chris has the better laugh. You'll hear that. But so this right away in the book, you sort of give away the plot. Mm-hmm. He wasn't really breaking with the consensus. Right. So tell me about that.
I mean, he sensed correctly that there was a great anxiety and frustration among the American people towards U.S. foreign policy, and And he at least suggested that he might want to do something different. Again, when you actually parse what it is that he intended to do different, it turns out it wasn't that he didn't want to fight the wars. He wanted to fight them differently. He didn't want to lose the wars. He wanted to win them, which means, changing the rules of engagement and things like that, which is what's happened on his watch. But the other thing we have to remember is the gap between the public and the foreign policy community in terms of that's been promoting this idea in the United States has existed for a long, long time. When pollsters, even going back to the early Cold War period, asked Americans about, do they support the kinds of alliances we have? Do they support a forward military presence? Do they support an active military? A lot of times the public said no, but there was never a candidate that came forward that really spoke to that public sentiment. And so that was never activated. And truthfully, foreign policy is not very high on people's agendas in terms of politics in general.
So you provide a very useful couple of chapters tracing this, the development, and including with, well, to your point, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who warned about the pervasive influence of the military-industrial complex, but yet supported having a global U.S. military presence.
That's right. He warned, of course, about the disconnect between the public and this sense that growing power sort of aggrandized to Washington, D.C., to the military-industrial complex. Again, I think there's a great sort of tragic tone to Eisenhower's farewell address because he did believe that it was necessary to compete with the Soviet Union. But I think what would most disappoint him today is that it persisted long after the Soviet Union collapsed. And I think that would prove that he was correct, that it resulted in a change in the sort of political economy, a change in the way that Americans approached military power.
And why didn't this change after the collapse of the Soviet Union? You talk about this a little bit. Mm-hmm. When we had the chance to sort of stand down, when, for example, in the Clinton era, mm-hmm. we started drawing down, finally, the military mm-hmm. budget. It started coming down. But there was this crucial turning point, and I'm glad you bring this in the book because I've always considered this extremely important, and that's the 1991 Gulf War and its aftermath.
Right. So obviously, George H.W. Bush was president when the Berlin Wall came down, and the first sort of major exercise of American military power after that was the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait and the U.S. coalition that drove him out of Kuwait. Immediately after that war, his administration sort of set about sort of what's going to be the big idea, what's the grand strategy after the end of the Cold War, and the answer was that the United States would continue to maintain military dominance to discourage other countries, any other country, including U.S. allies like Germany and Japan, from even aspiring to a larger global role. That's practically a direct quote. The notion that other countries might want or be empowered to take a greater role in their own security or regional security was strongly discouraged by first the Bush 41 administration and then the Clinton administration. And I think the critical decision within the Clinton years was the decision to expand NATO eastward towards Russia's border. That was not necessarily going to happen. George H.W. Bush was open to the idea, and the Clinton administration really stepped on the gas.
Right. So what the Clinton administration did for, I think you may say, laudable reasons. Mm-hmm. They were concerned about making sure that Europe remained stable mm-hmm. and that the countries that had now been liberated from Soviet occupation now had a place to go. They still did it guided by this idea of primacy. Madeleine Albright called it indispensable nation, but it still was consistent with this, and I'm glad you talk about it in this book, this 1992 leaked defense planning guidance that when it was leaked was widely derided because it talked about, and let me quote from the book, that the primary goal should be to prevent the reemergence of a new rival, and that the goal of U.S. policy should be a world with U.S. primacy. And Republicans and Democrats may see how to implement that goal differently, but they don't question the goal. That's what they all want. And this is what you're taking issue with, right?
Correct. Ultimately, because I think it is extraordinarily arrogant, hubristic for the United States to believe that for now and forever, the United States is going to be able to dominate the planet in the way that we did for a good part of the Cold War period. Again, we were competing with the Soviet Union. We're bumping up against practical limits to our power. We see it every day, and yet I think the Washington foreign policy establishment is reluctant to admit to those limits.
Yeah, I mean, the policy planning guidance lays out a vision of American primacy, which kind of demands the active exercise of military force. And it might be a useful time to just kind of admit our own personal biases here. We work for a libertarian think tank, and that means that we're very, very skeptical of concentrations of power. The exercise of arbitrary power is something that kind of classically liberal-minded people should be weary of and skeptical of. And when you have the United States, which had such disproportionate power around the world, that is a recipe for the exercise of arbitrary power in ways that I think are not democratically accountable. I mean, we can talk about the withering away of the rule of law and Congress's constitutional power to determine the nation's involvement in hostilities abroad. That's not up to the president. And yet, again, primacy has allowed a concentration of power in the executive branch that is at times seems unaccountable.
One of the things you note in the book is how the neoconservatives embrace this idea of primacy. And you could say, to be fair to them, for noble reasons. They thought this was the best way to spread democracy. But they mock our founders, specifically the president that you quote, John Quincy Adams, who said that America does not go abroad in search of monsters. And you quote them and saying, because they say, this is William Kristol and Robert Kagan write in 96, because America has the capacity to contain or destroy many of the world's monsters, most of which can be found without much searching, and because the responsibility for the peace and security of the international order rests so heavily on America's shoulders, a policy of sitting atop a hill and leading by example becomes in practice a policy of cowardice and dishonor.
Right.
So they're blasting your idea.
Yes.
Respond.
Well, one way to describe cowardice and dishonor is claiming that you hold to certain principles and then acting directly contradictory to those principles when you engage abroad. So one of the problems with primacy is that we're trying to establish international order based on American power. And that means sometimes advocating against, disorderly actions, Russia's incursions into Ukraine, for example. But it's hard to really punish or criticize other powers for engaging in behavior that we engage in as a matter of routine. Mm-hmm. The Iraq War itself was a war crime, lacked UN Security Council approval, lacked self-defense case. It got authorization from Congress, but that's not all you should need. It's difficult to tell countries to abide by human rights values that we, as the indispensable nation, allegedly sort of purport to be the guarantor of, when we're helping one of the most regressive authoritarian regimes in the world bomb Yemen relentlessly to the detriment of many millions of people. So, I think leading by example and doing no harm abroad is a better posture and a more ethical one than theirs.
Because they were laying the groundwork in 92 in the policy guidance, and then in 96 for their ability to implement their vision, which of course was the Iraq War.
Correct.
Kagan and Kristol and many others were directly engaged in that, cheerleaders for it, paid no price for the mistakes that they made, and those views still prevail, and they are still well-respected Washington analysts, right? But you give us a scorecard for how we can judge this theory. This is the great thing about policy. It leaves a track record. So what do you think the scorecard is for this theory of American primacy?
I think the scorecard is a grim one. And I say that with no, I don't like to say that. I'm an American. I'm a patriotic American. I don't like saying that the actions the United States has taken over the last 20 years have led to ruin, not merely for the United States, but for much of the rest of the world. And I think we have to assess policy not on the intentions of those who wield it, but on the actual results. And so I want to echo what John said in terms of there is nothing noble and principled about undertaking policies that result in sort of human carnage and wreckage. And that's what I think the war in Iraq, above all others, certainly did. But we shouldn't restrict our attention to that. I mean, look at what happened in Libya after the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. Again, the neoconservatives were very supportive of this, but this is an intervention that was conducted by the Obama administration. I think that that suggests to me that we have not learned well enough the lessons of regime change wars that result in just horrible human suffering and don't advance American or global security.
Joe, I think your question gets actually to the heart of the whole grand strategy debate, because I agree with Chris that much of U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the last 30 years, when we should have done this reevaluation of U.S. strategy in the aftermath of the Cold War, has been ruinous. On the other hand, we have to be able to disentangle global trends in certain direction that I think are very positive and, U.S. foreign policy. So a lot of what primacists like to claim credit for is that, well, the number of democracies around the world has proliferated under American leadership. The number of interstate wars has gone down. Right. The wars that do occur are now less deadly. These kinds of things are good. The wealth generating capacity of the global economy now is, unprecedented. But if you ascribe responsibility and credit for all of those things on U.S. foreign policy, it starts to look pretty good. I actually think a lot of those result from emergent processes. So, for example, the trend away from interstate war, the much more peaceful world that we're living in, that has a lot to do with bottom-up feelings. The norms around war have simply changed. It used to be something that you aspire to, that made your country manly and virtuous.
Yes.
And now even the warmongers among us tend to talk about it something as a last resort. And I think people the world over agree with that. Democracy promotion as well. Sometimes we've supported democracy and sometimes we've supported the exact opposite. Sometimes we've overthrown governments that have shown prospects for democratic reforms and imposed dictatorships in their place. But a lot of democracy promotion around the world has been emergent, people realizing that this is a better system than the authoritarian ways of the old. Same thing with wealth generation. Trade alone doesn't need a director up at the top to guide things. It's a very dynamic process, millions of transactions a day or even an hour. That creates wealth. You add in things like nuclear weapons to tamp down great power war and the destructive power of modern conventional militaries, and the world looks more peaceful, safer, and more wealthy and more democratic, largely because of things that I think are outside the realm of U.S. foreign policy top down.
Yeah, I saw a simplified version of this in a debate panel I was on a couple of years ago. I was with a brigadier general in charge of the strategic command, and we were debating nuclear policy. And he had this winning line where he said, "Nuclear weapons save lives. They have kept the peace for 74 years, And right, and that is the image, and the crowd applauded. That was great, but of course he's simplifying it.
Right.
He's claiming credit for this military instrument and negating all the other things that have done: the institution building, the alliances, the diplomacy, the NATO alliance, conventional force structures, international monetary systems. All the other things that we do get brushed aside and is presented as our military dominance that has kept the peace. This is one of your central points, right?
Absolutely. I mean, a good social scientist would tell you that correlation does not equal causation, right? And there's a huge problem of sort of American power being the overdetermined explanation for everything good that has happened since the end of the Second World or since the end of the Cold War. We have an entire project at the Cato Institute called Human Progress. We are cognizant of the way that our lives are getting better. We're living longer, healthier lives. Even the poorest people on the planet are living better lives. But very, very little of that is directly attributable to American military dominance, and at least some measure of American military dominance is to blame for the bad effects of what's happening around the world.
Okay, let me quickly walk through two other parts of your book, which is how Trump made things worse. Explain that to me. And then your principles for how we can make things better.
Well, Trump made things worse in a lot of ways. The presidency.
This is only a 25-minute interview.
Yeah, I can't go too long. But the first thing that we should recognize is that the presidency bestows a lot of prestige on an individual. And I think people in general begin to assume that the president, in this case Trump, has more command over the policy area that he now has ultimate authority over than he actually does, just by virtue of the position he has. He hasn't spent many years thinking deeply about the role of America in the world and where he fits on a broad spectrum of U.S. foreign policy or grand strategy preferences. And so his impulses and his kind of ad hoc approach to policymaking make it impossible to make progress even on those things that I think Trump is actually kind of sensible on.
Right, like a deal with North Korea.
Like a deal with North Korea. He's mishandled.
Good idea. Talk to Kim Jong-un, fine. Let's make a deal. Impossible for him to actually do it.
Right, because I think he's more interested in the stagecraft than the statecraft of it. And the same thing with Syria. We recently got over this 2-week hysteria over Syria policy, and there was a lot to be concerned about, certainly. But from the beginning, he explained the entire thing as an attempt to end endless wars. And that's not what was happening at all. First of all, he was refusing to engage in the interagency process to make an actual withdrawal doable.
Yes.
And furthermore, he cannot seem to unify even his own cabinet around a clear strategy, which means that he has all this bureaucratic infighting against these impulses. And because they're impulses and not views, he can't follow through in the future and make something more consistent out of it.
So as you point out, there is no Trump doctrine.
That's
There's
right.
a series of impulses and random actions.
And a lot of domestic considerations.
Yeah. Let's go to the principles you establish for how we can resolve this. Am I right? The principle number 1 is reject primacy?
That's
okay,
right.
How do we do that?
I think it starts with a realization of the limits of American power. And again, Americans don't want to hear this, but it's just all around us. We are a powerful country, but we are not omnipotent. We cannot do everything. We need other countries to be sharing the burden of governance, of peacekeeping, of facilitating the kinds of human flourishing that we've been talking about on this show. And the good news is that most countries, because they benefit from these trends, have every incentive to continue pulling in that direction. There's very few people around the world that are resistant to this. And so the notion that if it were not for the United States of America pulling the planet towards progress, then it would just fall back into chaos, and it's just utterly absurd. And I think because of Trump, because of all the pathologies we've talked about in terms of his impulses and his inability to actually execute policy, I think we are starting to see some other countries behave in a slightly more responsible fashion, realizing that they can't simply just sort of give in to the United States as sort of being in charge of everything, and sort of much more a willingness on the part of other countries to do
You're talking
more.
Specifically about some of our European allies.
I think the European allies, some of our Asian allies too. Even in the case we mentioned the North Korea case, South Korea's government, changed. It was a scandal and things like that. But the new South Korean president was much more open to the idea of negotiations, and I think that certainly helped.
Even non-allies. China has done a lot over the past 30 or so years to conform itself with the international system, and it's benefited greatly from that. And so to make an enemy out of it or to draw it as an inherently revisionist power, I think is a mistake. We can probably engage in some cooperative governance policies.
Well, this gets us to your second principle, but you want to flip the script here. Emphasize diplomacy, not military force?
That's right. I think, there's a lot of cheap and workable ways to engage in American leadership of a sort without thinking that the military is the only tool in the toolbox.
And that includes rebuilding the State Department if we get the chance?
Absolutely. I think skilled statecraft by experienced diplomats is an asset that a power like ours needs to take advantage of and not dismiss because it's what the wussies do is talk. I think we need to acknowledge that diplomacy is actually the forefront of our foreign policy.
U.S. foreign policy is overly militarized, and it means, in the strictest sense, the military performs roles that once upon a time were performed by diplomats. Now, in some respect, it's because, well, why not? Because they're there and they can do it, and in many cases, they're okay, but ultimately, it still is a military instrument. The military has a particular role to play, and diplomacy, negotiations, compromise, those sorts of things are not usually best pursued by our military.
And your third principle is that foreign policy should reflect liberal values and norms. What do you mean?
Well, the most important of which is non-interference, right? We believe in the rights
the U.S.
of
not interfering in the affairs of other countries.
Sort of hard
you know
to
who we are.
Yes, I know.
So that there's an irony in that, because I think people forget that the foundation of the sort of globalist design in the post-World War II period, the foundation of the UN system was non-interference in the affairs of other countries. Right. That's what people at the time determined would tamp down the war-prone nature of the international system, and I think it still can. It's just that we haven't abided by that principle.
And hearkening back to the founding era, right? John Quincy Adams and others, they envisioned an America that would lead by example, that we would create a society here that was worthy of emulation, that people wanted to be like us. We could be that country again, but we've convinced ourselves that the only way that we can be a leader in the world is through our military prowess. I think, again, the experience of the last 20 years has shown that isn't actually true, but we still can lead on many other issues.
Well, not just military prowess. I mean, we actively subverted governments around the world with the funding, with the secret operations.
Right.
You know, the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953 in Iran. Was that a military operation? Not exactly.
Not exactly.
You know, but also heavily influenced in things. And ironically, now we see Russia employing some of those same techniques in their penetration of Western societies by influencing the autocratic nativist parties that are coming up with funding, using propaganda purposes. So it's in our interest, right?
Yes.
To sort of strengthen the norm against non-interference.
To live by the values that we proclaim others should adhere to.
Well, thank you. This is just wonderful. I strongly urge our listeners to pick up this book. It's worth your while. Fuel to the Fire: How Trump Made America's Broken Foreign Policy Even Worse and How We Can Recover. It's got 3 co-authors, John Glaser, Christopher A. Preble, and A. Trevor Thrall. And where can people write for more information?
So this book is published by the Cato Institute, our intellectual home. So you can go to www.cato.org and read about the book. We have a promotional sort of page there. You can buy the book at any of your favorite booksellers, and we'd love to hear more. So tweet at us, text us, and let us know what you think.
Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Joe.
Really great to be here.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.